When you think of outlaws in the Wild West, the names that come to mind are almost always painted in black and white. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, the Dalton Gang, stories of gunfights, bank robberies, train heists, and wanted posters plastered across dusty towns. Hollywood and dime novels turned them into legends of good versus evil. Sheriffs chasing rogues across the frontier, law and order clashing with lawlessness. But the truth of these outlaws is far more complicated, far murkier, and in many ways far more human than the myths allow. They weren't always villains, and they weren't always heroes. They were men and sometimes women shaped by a brutal landscape, by war, poverty, greed, and survival. And many of the most infamous names were also the most misunderstood. Let's start with Jesse James, to most. He's the quintessential outlaw, the cold-blooded robber, the face on the wanted poster, the folk devil of Missouri. But if you peel back the myth, Jesse wasn't born a criminal. He was born into a fractured America, where the Civil War ripped families apart and neighbors turned on each other. Jesse grew up in Missouri, a border state drenched in blood where guerrilla warfare was as common as church bells. His older brother, Frank, rode with Confederate bushwhackers, raiding Union sympathizers, burning farms, and ambushing soldiers. Jesse himself was barely a teenager when he was pulled into this violence. By the time the war ended, he had seen horrors most men wouldn't forget in a lifetime. When he turned to robbery after the war, it wasn't just greed, it was rebellion. To some, Jesse was stealing from the institutions that had destroyed the South, punishing banks and railroads seen as symbols of Northern power. To others, he was nothing but a killer lining his own pockets. The truth? He was both. Jesse lived in a world where the lines between outlaw and avenger blurred, where one man's villain was another man's folk hero. Then there's Billy the Kid, the eternal boy outlaw, frozen forever in that one surviving photograph. Hat tilted, rifle at his side, a smirk on his lips. The legend says he killed 21 men, one for each year of his short life, a gunslinger who lived and died by the pistol. But historians know the number is closer to 4, maybe 5 at most. Billy wasn't a monster. He was a product of chaos. He was orphaned young, drifting through saloons and cattle camps, working odd jobs to survive. What pulled him into infamy wasn't some bloodlust, but the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, a feud between rival business factions that turned the county into a battlefield. Billy fought on the side of the regulators, not out of some noble cause, but because he found loyalty and belonging in their ranks. He wasn't hunting men for sport. He was trying to stay alive in a war where everyone carried a gun, and every friend could become an enemy overnight. The tragedy of Billy the Kid is not that he was an outlaw. It's that he became the face of a struggle that chewed up dozens of men like him, nameless and forgotten. His myth grew after death, exaggerated by newspapers and story sellers, until the boy became the legend, and the legend eclipsed the man. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, thanks to Hollywood, we see them as charming rogues, the Robin Hoods of the Rockies, smiling as they rob banks, riding into the sunset with panache. And in some ways that image isn't entirely wrong. Butch, whose real name was Robert Leroy Parker, was never a violent man by the standards of the time. He rarely shot anyone, preferring wit and planning over bloodshed. He grew up poor in Utah, the son of Mormon pioneers, learning early that the system was stacked against men like him. Banks and cattle barons controlled the West, and small ranchers were often crushed under their power. Butch turned to robbery not just for money, but as a way of striking back at those institutions. He was generous with friends, loyal to his gang, and even respected by some of his victims for his politeness during robberies. The Sundance Kid, Harry Longabaugh, was quieter, deadlier when pushed, but still far from the cold killers people imagine. Their story ended in Bolivia, far from home in a desperate gunfight. But what lingers is how misunderstood they were. Not monsters, not saints, but men who chose crime as a way to carve out dignity in a world that gave them little. Another misunderstood figure is Belle Starr, often called the Bandit Queen. History and dime novels painted her as a pistol-wielding temptress, riding with gangs of men, robbing stagecoaches, running her own outlaw empire. The truth is, Belle's life was more tragedy than glamour. She was married to outlaws, yes, and she moved in their circles, but much of her so-called career was exaggerated by newspapers hungry for a female outlaw to sell papers. She did commit crimes, horse theft, aiding fugitives, but the wild stories of her being a female Jesse James were creations of the press. Belle lived hard, surrounded by violence, trying to survive in a world that gave women little agency. Her death, shot in the back on a lonely road, was more fitting for a tale of betrayal than a dime novel adventure. Misunderstood in life, she became a caricature in death, remembered more for the lies told about her than the truth of who she was. And then there's Sam Bass, a name less famous today but legendary in his time. Bass was branded an outlaw for robbing trains, most famously the Union Pacific Express in Nebraska, where he and his gang took thousands in gold. But Sam wasn't some hardened criminal mastermind. He had once been a law-abiding young man, trying to make a living as a cowboy and later as a gambler. When those paths failed him, crime became the only way to scrape by. What made Bass different was his demeanor. He wasn't cruel, and he often treated his victims with a strange sense of respect. Some even saw him as a folk hero, a man striking back at the wealthy companies squeezing working folks. His end came in a shootout with Texas Rangers, young and broken. Another man swallowed by the myth of outlawry. These are just a few names among dozens, men and women painted in broad strokes, turned into monsters or martyrs when the truth was far more complicated. The Wild West was not a storybook, not a black and white movie script. It was a raw, brutal world where choices were often forced by circumstance, where lawmen and outlaws weren't so different, and where the legends we know were written by those who survived to tell the tale. To call Jesse James only a criminal or Billy the Kid only a killer is to miss the point. They were symbols, yes, but they were also people, living in a time when survival sometimes meant breaking the rules, and when being misunderstood was almost inevitable. And that's the key to this journey. The misunderstood outlaws of the Wild West aren't just legends to gawk at. They're windows into the struggles of a nation being built on violence, greed, and grit. To understand them is to understand the West itself, not as a land of heroes and villains, but as a place where the truth is always murkier than the myth. If the famous names of the West are tangled in myth, then the lesser-known outlaws are practically drowned in it. They lived in the shadow of dime novels, where writers twisted their lives into pulp adventures. Yet behind those stories were real people whose reputations were built as much by rumor as by their actions. Consider John Wesley Hardin, often called the deadliest gunman in the West. The legend says he killed more than 40 men, shot a man just for snoring too loudly, and was so fast with a pistol that no one could best him. It paints him as a cold-blooded killer, a man who lived by violence alone. But the real Hardin was something else entirely, a man shaped by a violent childhood in Texas. Growing up in the years after the Civil War when law was weak and blood feuds ruled the countryside, Hardin did kill, that much is true, but many of his so-called murders were the result of shootouts, ambushes, and moments where survival came down to drawing quicker than the other man. Did he brag and exaggerate his own record? Certainly. Did the newspapers embellish even further? Without a doubt. He spent years on the run, hunted by rangers, living in fear that any corner could bring death. When he was finally captured and imprisoned, he studied law, tried to reform, and upon release actually became a lawyer. Imagine that a man remembered as a ruthless killer, standing in court to defend clients, trying to live by the very system he once rejected. But fate caught up with him in a saloon, where he was shot in the back. Hardin was a contradiction, feared and hated, but also a symbol of how a violent time can twist men into roles they never wanted. Then there's Clay Allison, remembered in lore as a wild-eyed killer, a man so unstable that even other outlaws feared him. He fought in the Civil War, suffered a head injury that left him prone to sudden bursts of rage, and carried a reputation for violence everywhere he went. The stories say he killed dozens, that he danced naked on barroom tables, that he was the very embodiment of frontier madness. But when you dig deeper, a different picture emerges. Allison did shoot men, but most of his killings were in duels or confrontations where the line between self-defense and murder was blurred. He was also known for moments of kindness, for helping neighbors, for generosity that didn't fit the image of a mad killer. In truth, Allison was likely battling what today we'd call trauma, brain injury, and untreated mental illness. His legend grew not because he was uniquely monstrous, but because the West loved a tale of a man who seemed larger than life. The truth is more tragic. A man damaged by war and circumstance, misunderstood by history that only remembered the blood and not the humanity. Then we arrive at the Dalton Gang, famous for one of the most disastrous robberies in frontier lore. The legend says they were ruthless, reckless men who pushed their luck too far when they tried to rob 2 banks at once in Coffeyville, Kansas, only to be gunned down in a bloody shootout. The photos of their bodies laid out for the public cemented their place in outlaw history. But the Daltons didn't start as villains. In fact, they began as lawmen deputy marshals who rode the frontier enforcing justice. They were brothers who watched the law twist and fail, who saw how crime often paid better than duty, and who slowly drifted across that thin line between enforcing the law and breaking it. When they formed their gang, they weren't just criminals, they were disillusioned men betrayed by the system they once served. Their final heist was meant to secure enough money to disappear forever, to start new lives far from the reach of the U.S. Marshals. Instead, it became their tombstone. Misunderstood? Absolutely. They weren't driven purely by greed or cruelty. They were men who lost faith in a system and paid the price for trying to escape it. Doc Holliday is another name that fits uneasily in the outlaw category. To some, he was a gambler and killer, a drunken dentist turned gunfighter who cut down men in saloons and streets. But Doc was more than that. He was a man dying slowly of tuberculosis, coughing blood into his handkerchief as he wandered the West searching for a climate that might prolong his life. Gambling was his profession, not gunfighting, though violence followed him often enough. His friendship with Wyatt Earp pulled him into some of the most famous moments in frontier lore, most notably the gunfight at the OK Corral. The myth paints him as a deadly gunslinger, but in reality, he wasn't as quick or deadly as the stories suggest. He survived not by skill alone, but by desperation, by having little to lose. He was witty, educated, loyal to his friends, and tortured by his illness. To call him just an outlaw misses the heart of his story. He wasn't misunderstood because of lies told about him. He was misunderstood because the truth of a frail man fighting against his own mortality was less exciting than the myth of a gunfighter with nerves of steel. And then there's Cherokee Bill, one of the most feared outlaws of Indian Territory. His name was whispered with dread, his reputation built on robberies and murders. But his story is one of youth squandered, a young man barely in his 20s when he was executed. He was of mixed African American and Cherokee heritage, growing up in a world where prejudice and hardship pressed down on him from all sides. He turned to crime young, joining gangs that offered belonging when society offered nothing. His violence was real, his crimes undeniable. But the legend of Cherokee Bill as a ruthless monster overlooks the truth that he was a boy, molded by abandonment, racism, and poverty. Misunderstood? Yes, in the sense that history remembers him as a symbol of savagery, rather than a symptom of a brutal world that gave him few choices. What ties all of these figures together is that none of them were the simple villains they've been painted to be. Their stories are layered, complicated by circumstance, distorted by newspapers that needed to sell copies and by Hollywood scripts that needed heroes and villains. The reality of the Wild West was not neat, not clean, and not moral in the way we like our stories to be. Every outlaw, every so-called villain carried pieces of humanity, love for family, loyalty to friends, codes of honor that didn't always match the law but mattered to them nonetheless. And perhaps that's why these misunderstood outlaws fascinate us so much. Because in their stories we don't just see criminals, we see the rawest reflection of the frontier itself. A place where survival blurred the line between right and wrong, where the law was as corrupt as the men it chased, and where ordinary people could become legends simply by how others chose to remember them. They weren't just killers or thieves. They were men and women caught in a storm of history, making choices that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. If we keep pulling at the threads of these outlaw legends, we find even more names caught in the same trap of misunderstanding stories where fact and fiction twisted together until the truth was almost unrecognizable. Take the story of Henry Plummer, for instance. Depending on which account you read, Plummer was either a ruthless outlaw who used his badge to mask a reign of terror, or a lawman unfairly accused and lynched by vigilantes. He came west young, settling in Bannock, Montana, a mining boomtown where law and order was scarce and gold fever was rampant. Plummer wore a sheriff's badge, but rumors began to swirl that he led a secret gang of road agents who robbed stagecoaches and murdered travelers. Whether he truly masterminded those crimes or whether he became a scapegoat for a town desperate to impose order is still debated by historians. What is certain is that he was dragged out by vigilantes in 1864 and hanged without a fair trial. His name became synonymous with betrayal and corruption, but the deeper story suggests a man misunderstood either by lies that condemned him or by a reputation that grew darker with every retelling. Another misunderstood figure is Kid Curry, real name Harvey Logan, often called the most violent member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. Newspapers painted him as a cold-blooded killer who left a trail of bodies across the West. But dig into his past, and you find a man born into hardship, orphaned young, trying to survive in a country where violence was almost a currency. He did kill, yes, and he could be ruthless when cornered. But to those who knew him, he was fiercely loyal, a man who cared for his brothers and friends, who joked and sang and lived with a kind of restless energy. His violence was often the product of desperation, fueled by a temper he couldn't always control, but his humanity is often erased by the headlines that needed a villain. In the end, he died young, either by his own hand or in a firefight, another outlaw who became more myth than man. Then there's Tom Horn, a figure caught between worlds. Horn was a cowboy, a scout, an interpreter, a Pinkerton detective, and eventually, a hired gun. His legend paints him as an assassin for cattle barons, killing rustlers and anyone who stood in their way. But the reality is murkier. Horn was a skilled tracker, a man who spoke multiple languages, who rode with the army in campaigns against Apache leaders like Geronimo. He lived by his wits and skills, respected for his talents but feared for his temper. When he was accused of murdering a 14-year-old boy during a conflict between cattlemen and homesteaders, his trial was swift and questionable. Many historians believe the evidence was flimsy, that Horn was made into a scapegoat because his reputation made him an easy target. He was hanged for the crime, insisting to the end that he had been wrongfully convicted. Was he an outlaw? Perhaps at times. Was he misunderstood? Almost certainly, because his story is as much about the struggles of the West itself, torn between old ways and new, as it is about one man's guilt or innocence. Consider also the story of Belle Starr, often lumped into Western lore as a female outlaw. Her name became infamous as a so-called Black Widow killer, accused of murdering multiple husbands and suitors in Indiana and on the frontier. But while her case veers into the sensational, the way she was portrayed by newspapers reveals how women in the West were often cast into extremes, angelic pioneers or wicked outlaws. For Belle, the reality was twisted by sensationalist coverage, turning her into a monstrous caricature. She lived in a world where women had little power or opportunity, and while her actions were undeniably criminal, the myth of her as a demonic outlaw tells us more about society's hunger for villains than about the woman herself. Even the story of Black Bart, the so-called gentleman bandit, shows how misunderstanding shaped legacy. Black Bart, real name Charles Bowles, robbed Wells Fargo stagecoaches in California during the 1870s and 1880s. But unlike the violent desperados of dime novels, Bart was polite, never harmed passengers, and sometimes even left behind witty poems at the scene of his crimes. Newspapers portrayed him as a clever rogue, almost a folk hero, ignoring the desperation that led him to crime in the first place. He was a miner who had lost everything, a man scraping by in a world that left little room for failure. His legend grew not because of the truth, but because the press loved the idea of a gentleman thief. When he was finally caught, the myth unraveled, and he lived out his days quietly, his story fading into half-truths and embellishments. Then we must remember Bass Reeves, one of the most remarkable figures of the frontier, though often miscast in the outlaw tradition, when in reality, he was the law. Reeves was born into slavery, escaped during the Civil War, and became one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi. He arrested thousands of outlaws, survived countless gunfights, and earned the respect of friend and foe alike. Yet for decades his story was forgotten, overshadowed by white lawmen whose names became household legends. Some even speculate that Reeves's career inspired the fictional Lone Ranger, though the credit was never given. While Reeves was not an outlaw, the way his story was sidelined reflects how misunderstanding, sometimes deliberate erasure, shaped the narrative of the Wild West. To tell his story alongside the misunderstood outlaws is fitting, because it reminds us how easily history can distort or forget the truth. As we sift through these lives, we start to see a pattern. Outlaws were rarely the cardboard villains of popular imagination. They were shaped by hardship, by wars that left young men rootless, by economies that crushed the poor while enriching the few, by law enforcement that was often as corrupt as the criminals it pursued. And when their stories reached the public, they were twisted by dime novelists and journalists who understood that exaggeration sold better than accuracy. A killer of 4 became a killer of 21. A thief of cattle became a feared desperado. A lawman turned bad became a symbol of lawlessness itself. Misunderstanding wasn't an accident. It was the very fuel that kept their legends alive. Think about the frontier towns that depended on storytelling to hold their communities together. A robbery wasn't just a crime. It became a story repeated in saloons, each telling making it bigger, bloodier, more exciting. And once newspapers picked it up, the exaggeration solidified. Outlaws became celebrities in a time before movies, their names whispered across states, their faces printed in illustrations that rarely looked like them. By the time Hollywood got hold of these tales decades later, the truth was almost gone, replaced by scripts that needed clean heroes and dirty villains. And yet, despite all the myth-making, what draws us back to these misunderstood figures is the humanity beneath the legend. The fact that Jesse James may have been both killer and folk hero, that Billy the Kid may have been both lost boy and outlaw, that Butch Cassidy may have been both thief and gentleman. These contradictions are what keep their stories alive. Because they weren't monsters. They were people. People caught in a world that demanded survival. A world where choices were brutal, and the line between right and wrong shifted with every passing train and every rising sun. When we reach the end of this trail, looking back over the dust and echoes of these outlaw lives, we start to see the West itself not as a battlefield between good and evil, but as a vast stage where human beings played roles. They never chose roles written by poverty, war, loss, and the relentless march of history. The outlaws we've talked about were not simply villains with pistols and wanted posters. They were sons and daughters, brothers and fathers, dreamers and desperados, all caught in a world that misunderstood them, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. Think about Jesse James once more, the farm boy turned guerrilla fighter turned outlaw legend. To some, he was a cold killer. To others, he was a Robin Hood striking back against the powers that had crushed the South. But strip away the myths, and what remains is a young man scarred by war, trying to find meaning in violence because peace had no place for him. He wasn't misunderstood just by history. He was misunderstood in his own lifetime. Hated and celebrated in equal measure. Never allowed to simply be Jesse. Or Billy the Kid, the eternal boy, frozen forever at 21, remembered as a smiling killer who supposedly notched 21 lives. But when the dust of exaggeration clears, what you find is a lonely young man swept into a feud he didn't start, a boy who wanted belonging more than bloodshed, who killed not for glory, but for survival. His myth outgrew his humanity, and the misunderstood truth of his short life is that he wasn't the demon people claimed, nor the saint others hoped for. He was something more fragile, more fleeting, and perhaps that's why his story endures. Then there's Doc Holliday, coughing blood into a handkerchief, gambling his nights away, and finding in Wyatt Earp the one friendship strong enough to anchor him in a drifting life. He's remembered as a deadly gunman, a man who shot his way into history at the OK Corral. But his truth is quieter and sadder, a man who knew death was chasing him and tried to live faster than the disease eating him alive. Misunderstood because the myth of a fearless killer sells better than the story of a sick man who never stopped fighting against his own body. And look at the Dalton gang. The brothers who began as lawmen and ended as outlaws, remembered for one disastrous day in Coffeyville. History calls them reckless, foolish, greedy. But the misunderstanding is that they weren't chasing riches, they were chasing escape. One final score to buy their freedom from a world that had already branded them criminals. Their story is less about villainy and more about desperation, about brothers trying to find a way out and paying the ultimate price. What all of these stories show us is that the Wild West was never simple. The law wasn't always noble, and the outlaw wasn't always cruel. They existed in a frontier where survival blurred morality, where newspapers and storytellers shaped reputations faster than the truth could catch up, and where being misunderstood was often the price of simply living. An outlaw could become a legend overnight, not because of what they did, but because of what others said they did. And once a man became a legend, the truth no longer mattered. Think of the audiences in the East reading dime novels by lamplight, hungering for tales of the savage frontier. They wanted clear heroes and clear villains, not messy realities. And so men like Sam Bass, who treated his victims kindly, became outlaws painted in bold, bloody colors. Women like Belle Starr, who struggled in a male-dominated world, became caricatures of seduction and sin. Even men like Tom Horn, who may have been innocent of the crime that killed him, were condemned because their reputations made better headlines than their innocence ever could. The misunderstanding wasn't just an accident of history, it was baked into the very way the West was remembered. And yet, as much as misunderstanding obscures the truth, it's also what keeps these stories alive. Because in every myth is a kernel of reality, and in every exaggeration is a question: who were these people really? Why do their names still echo across the years? Why do we care? Perhaps because the misunderstood outlaw is the perfect reflection of our own contradictions. We are drawn to rebels, to those who break the rules, to those who live free even when freedom costs everything. But we also fear them, judge them, and need them to remain symbols instead of human beings. In the end, the misunderstood outlaws of the Wild West remind us that history is not just about what happened, it's about how we choose to remember what happened. The stories we tell reveal more about us than about them. Do we want Jesse James as a Robin Hood because it comforts us to think rebellion can be noble? Do we want Billy the Kid as a bloodthirsty killer because it makes the lawmen seem braver in defeating him? Do we want Doc Holliday as a fearless gunslinger because it is easier to cheer for courage than to face the truth of slow suffering? Every misunderstanding serves a purpose, and every myth tells us not just about the past, but about the storytellers who shaped it. So when you hear those names, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, Belle Starr, Clay Allison, John Wesley Hardin, don't just think of the wanted posters or the gunfights in movies. Think of the people behind them. Think of the poverty, the wars, the betrayals, the fleeting moments of kindness and laughter that were erased by history. Think of the way they were misunderstood, not because they were unknowable, but because the world needed them to be something bigger, simpler, more entertaining than the truth. And maybe that's the lasting lesson of the misunderstood outlaw. Not that they were heroes or villains, but that they were human beings whose stories remind us of the messy, complicated truth of history. That people are never as simple as the roles they're given. That myths can be powerful, but myths can also blind us. That the line between outlaw and legend is thinner than we think. As the dust settles and the sun sets on the frontier, we're left with echoes, gunshots, hoofbeats, laughter in saloons, cries of grief in lonely camps. Outlaws were not just outlaws. They were misunderstood mirrors of their time, reflecting back the violence, the hope, the fear, and the dreams of a nation finding itself. And maybe that's why more than a century later we're still telling their stories, still searching for the truth in the myths, still asking who they really were, and who we are for remembering them the way we do.